In the summer of 1944, a 43-year-old SS general stood in a farmhouse in Normandy and gave an order, and that order resulted in the execution of at least 41 Canadian soldiers who had already surrendered and were no longer a threat to anyone. And the man who gave that order was not some obscure functionary buried deep in the SS bureaucracy. He was one of the most decorated and celebrated combat commanders in the entire Waffen SS, a man who had fought in every major German campaign from Poland to Greece to Russia to France, a man whose soldiers worshipped him and whose enemies respected him, a man who had risen faster through the SS ranks than almost anyone in its history, and his name was Kurt Meyer, and they called him Panzermeyer. And his story is one of the most complicated and most uncomfortable stories of the entire Second World War. Because it is the story of a man who was genuinely brilliant at the thing he had chosen to do, and who used that brilliance in the service of crimes that no amount of military talent can excuse or explain away. Kurt Meyer was born in October 1910 in Yerxheim in Lower Saxony, and his early life was shaped by the poverty and instability of Weimar Germany, because Meyer was not from a privileged background. He was not the son of a military officer or a Prussian landowner. He was from a working-class family that struggled through the economic chaos of the 1920s, and the experience of growing up in that environment, watching Germany humiliated and impoverished in the years after the First World War, shaped his politics in exactly the way that the Nazi movement was designed to shape the politics of young men from exactly that background. Because the Nazis understood that the young men who felt most betrayed by the Weimar Republic were the most fertile recruiting ground for a movement that promised to restore German greatness. And Kurt Meyer was exactly that kind of young man. He joined the SS in 1931 at the age of 21, which made him one of the earlier volunteers in the organization's history, and from the beginning, he showed the qualities that would define his entire career: physical courage, aggressive energy, a natural instinct for leadership, and a complete absence of hesitation when it came to violence, and the SS recognized these qualities and promoted him steadily. And by the time the war began in September 1939, Meyer was already a company commander in the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the premier division of the Waffen SS and Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, and the war gave him the opportunity to demonstrate what he could do on a battlefield. Poland in September. 1939 was Meyer's first combat experience, and he threw himself into it with the aggression and energy that would become his trademark, and he performed well enough that he was given greater responsibility. And then came France in 1940, and Meyer performed well again. And then came Greece in 1941, and it was here that the first serious shadow fell across Meyer's combat record, because during the Greek campaign, Meyer's unit was involved in the capture of the Klissura Pass, and in the aftermath of that operation, Greek prisoners of war were killed. And the evidence suggests that Meyer was present and that the killings happened under his command. And while the chaos of combat sometimes produces situations where the line between legitimate military action and war crime is genuinely difficult to draw, the pattern that was emerging in Meyer's career was one that would repeat itself in much more documented and much more unambiguous form 3 years later in Normandy. But before Normandy came the Eastern Front, and the Eastern Front was where Kurt Meyer became a legend within the Waffen SS, because the war in Russia was the kind of war that suited his particular combination of talents perfectly: fast-moving, fluid, requiring constant improvisation and aggressive initiative, and Meyer thrived in it, leading his unit from the front with a personal fearlessness that his soldiers found inspiring and his superiors found invaluable. And the decorations accumulated: the Knight's Cross, the oak leaves, the swords, the highest military honors that Nazi Germany could bestow. And with each decoration came promotion, and Meyer rose through the ranks with a speed that was remarkable even by the standards of the rapidly expanding Waffen SS. And by the time he was given command of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend in 1944, he was one of the most celebrated combat commanders in the entire German military. A man whose name was known not just within the SS, but across the Wehrmacht and among the German public. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was one of the more extraordinary military formations of the entire war, because it was built almost entirely from boys who had been born in 1926, teenagers who had grown up in the Hitler Youth, and who had been recruited directly from it into the SS. And these boys were fanatical in a way that even the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front found remarkable, because they had been raised from childhood to believe that dying for Hitler and Germany was the highest possible achievement, and they had not lived long enough to develop the kind of survival instinct that makes older soldiers more cautious. And Meyer understood how to use this fanaticism, and he shaped the division into a fighting force that proved extraordinarily effective in the defensive battles of Normandy, holding ground against Allied forces that had every material advantage, and inflicting casualties that Allied commanders found shocking. But June 7th, 1944, the day after D-Day, was when everything changed, because on that day, soldiers of the Hitlerjugend Division captured a number of Canadian soldiers from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers near the Abbey of Ardenne, where Meyer had established his divisional headquarters. And what happened to those prisoners is one of the most documented war crimes committed against Western Allied forces during the entire war, because at least 41 Canadian soldiers who had been taken prisoner were executed, shot in the head at close range. Their bodies found in the gardens of the Abbey and in the fields around it. And the evidence collected after the war pointed directly to Meyer's headquarters as the location where the order to execute the prisoners had originated. The details of what happened at the Abbey of Ardenne on June 7th and in the days that followed are not in dispute in their broad outlines, because the physical evidence was clear and the testimony of witnesses was consistent. Young Canadian soldiers who had surrendered and been disarmed were brought to the Abbey and were killed there, and some of them were killed in a courtyard that was directly accessible from the building where Meyer had his command post. And the argument about Meyer's personal responsibility has centered not on whether the killings happened, which is beyond dispute, but on whether Meyer personally ordered them, or whether they were carried out by subordinates acting on their own initiative, or on the basis of a more general atmosphere of contempt for prisoners that Meyer had created within his division. And this is where the question of command responsibility becomes central, because even if Meyer did not personally give the specific order to shoot each individual prisoner, he was the commanding general of the division. He was physically present at the location where the killings occurred. The killings happened in the immediate aftermath of his assuming command of the division in combat, and the culture of the Hitlerjugend Division was one that he had shaped and that he was responsible for. And the argument that a commanding general bears no responsibility for war crimes committed by his troops at his own headquarters strains credibility to the breaking point, and the Canadian military tribunal that tried Meyer after the war clearly agreed. But before that tribunal came months more of fighting in Normandy, and Meyer's performance as a combat commander during the Normandy campaign was genuinely impressive by any military standard, because the Hitlerjugend division faced overwhelming Allied material superiority and held its positions with a stubbornness that cost the Allies dearly, and Meyer himself was everywhere, moving constantly between his units, appearing at crisis points, leading counterattacks personally, doing everything that a combat commander is supposed to do, and in a different war, in a different army, in different circumstances, he might have been remembered simply as one of the outstanding divisional commanders of the Second World War, but this was not a different war, and it was not a different army, and the circumstances were exactly what they were. In August 1944, Meyer was captured briefly by Belgian resistance fighters, but managed to escape, and he continued fighting through the retreat from Normandy and into Germany, and in September 1944, at the age of 33, he was promoted to SS Brigade Führer, making him the youngest divisional commander of general officer rank in the entire Waffen SS. And this promotion came with full knowledge of what had happened at the Abbey of Ardenne, because the Canadian government had already raised the issue through diplomatic channels, and the German military knew that Meyer was a man who would face serious questions if Germany lost the war. And Germany was, by September 1944, very clearly losing the war. Meyer was captured by American forces in December 1944 and was transferred to Canadian custody, and in December 1945, he was brought before a Canadian military tribunal at Aurich in Germany to face charges arising from the murders at the Abbey of Ardenne and from other incidents during the Normandy campaign. And the trial that followed was one of the first major war crimes trials of the post-war period, and established important precedents about command responsibility that influenced the development of international law in the decades that followed. The prosecution's case against Meyer rested on two foundations. First, the direct evidence linking the killings at the Abbey of Ardenne to his headquarters and to orders that had come from his command. And second, the broader principle that a commanding officer bears responsibility for crimes committed by troops under his command when those crimes result from a climate of contempt for the laws of war that the commanding officer has created and tolerated. And the evidence for both foundations was substantial, because witnesses testified to having heard orders that prisoners were not to be taken, and the physical evidence from the Abbey was conclusive about what had happened there, and the pattern of prisoner killings across the Hitlerjugend division's area of operations during June and July 1944 was too consistent and too widespread to be explained as isolated acts by individual soldiers acting without any kind of sanction from above. Meyer's defense was what you would expect from a man of his background and his psychology. He denied having given any order to execute prisoners. He claimed that the killings that had occurred were the unauthorized actions of individual soldiers. He presented himself as a professional soldier who had conducted himself according to the laws of war, and he maintained this position with the same self-confidence and aggression that had characterized everything else he had ever done. And in some respects, his defense was not entirely without merit, because the specific chain of command linking individual killings to specific orders from Meyer was difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt in every case. And the tribunal struggled with the gap between the overwhelming moral certainty that Meyer bore responsibility and the legal standard of proof required for a criminal conviction. The tribunal convicted Meyer on 3 of the 5 charges against him and sentenced him to death by shooting, and for a period of weeks it appeared that Kurt Meyer, Panzermeyer, the youngest SS general, the most decorated combat commander of the Hitlerjugend division, was going to be executed. And then something happened that tells you a great deal about the politics of the post-war period and about the way that military solidarity can override moral judgment, because the Canadian commanding general in Germany, General Christopher Vaux, reviewed the sentence and commuted it to life imprisonment. And his reasoning was that while Meyer was guilty of the crimes of which he had been convicted, the death penalty was not warranted. And this decision was controversial at the time and has remained controversial ever since. Because the families of the 41 Canadians who had been executed at the Abbey of Ardenne had a reasonable expectation that the man responsible for their sons' deaths would pay the full price that the law prescribed. Meyer served his life sentence in a Canadian military prison and then in a German prison after his custody was transferred, and the story of his imprisonment is itself a remarkable one, because Meyer proved to be an extraordinarily difficult prisoner to keep imprisoned, in the sense that he commanded such respect from the German military establishment and from certain segments of German society that pressure for his release began almost as soon as the ink was dry on his sentence, and the argument made on his behalf was essentially that he was a soldier who had fought for his country, and that the war crimes for which he had been convicted were the kind of thing that soldiers do in war, and that singling him out for continued punishment was unfair. And this argument found sympathetic ears in Germany in the early 1950s, as the Cold War changed the political calculus, and West Germany became a valued ally rather than a defeated enemy. Meyer was released from prison in September 1954, having served 9 years of his life sentence, and he was 43 years old when he walked out of Werl prison in West Germany, and the reception he received told you everything about how Germany was processing its recent past, because he was greeted as a hero by veterans organizations and by large sections of the German public, and he threw himself into the life of a celebrated veteran, writing his memoirs, giving speeches, and becoming one of the founding figures of the HIAG, the organization of Waffen SS veterans that spent the next several decades lobbying for the rehabilitation of the Waffen SS's reputation and for benefits for its veterans. And Meyer was one of the most prominent voices in this effort, consistently arguing that the Waffen SS had been a military organization like any other, and that its members deserved to be treated accordingly. The memoirs that Meyer published in 1957 under the title Grenadier became one of the best-selling war memoirs in post-war Germany, and they presented the story of his career in exactly the way that you would expect from a man of his psychology and his politics, as the story of a brilliant and dedicated soldier who had served his country with distinction and who had been unfairly singled out for punishment by the victorious Allies. And the war crimes that had sent him to prison were either minimized or explained away, or presented as the kind of thing that happens in war. And the 41 Canadian soldiers who had been executed at the Abbey of Ardenne appeared in his account in the same way that they appeared in the accounts of most German veterans of his generation, which is to say they barely appeared at all. Kurt Meyer died in September 1961 in Hagen in West Germany, exactly 17 years after the youngest general in the Waffen SS had received his final promotion, and he was 51 years old, and the obituaries in the German press treated him with a respect that his victims would have found incomprehensible, because the story of who Meyer really was and what he had really done was being told differently in Germany in 1961 than it had been told at Aurich in 1945. And the gap between those two tellings is itself a story about how societies choose to remember the things they have done and the people who did them. The 41 Canadian soldiers who died at the Abbey of Ardenne in June 1944 were young men from Nova Scotia and Quebec who had crossed the Atlantic to fight in a war that was not fought on their soil, and they died not in battle, but after they had already surrendered, shot in the head at close range in the gardens of a French abbey, and the man who bore command responsibility for their deaths served 9 years in prison and then spent the rest of his life being celebrated as a military hero. And the contrast between those two outcomes is the final judgment on the story of Kurt Meyer, Panzermeyer, the youngest general in the Waffen SS, the man who was sentenced to death and lived, and the men whose deaths he was responsible for, who had no such luck.